You know a guy who I told you out there I've gotten to know over the years. I didn't know him then, but it's Doug Newton, who was apparently Billy Martin's agent or manager, opened the Billy Martin stores, and then Doug has been enormously helpful in running the IMIS Cattle Ranch Kids with Cancer. He's one of the nicest, best guys I've ever met. And one of the few people who, if he tells you he's going to do something, he does it. Was he that way then when he was running?
Oh, yeah, and he was that way with me, actually, with this book. I spent a couple of days out in Palm Springs with Doug, and he was so helpful for me. And he is a great character in this book in that he's one of so many people that, with George, it was all about the pursuit. And once he bagged his quarry, he was no longer interested in him. I mean, you can go with free agents, with managers, or whatever. And in Doug's case, he was Billy Martin's agent when George fired Billy for the first time.
Right.
And what happened was Al Rosen was the president of the Yankees at the time, the general manager, and he was a guy that Billy Martin hated, and the feeling was mutual. They had been rivals, and Rosen played for the Cleveland Indians in the 50s, and they were rivals. So anyway, George fires Billy. He tells Rosen, "You got to go out to Kansas City and fire him." Only Billy didn't want to be fired by Rosen. He just couldn't bear that. So Billy decides to resign instead. And he has this tearful resignation out there. And Doug Newton is watching this on television, and he's horrified because Billy is basically self-destructing. He's giving up his money. Yeah. And so Newton calls George, and he says, "George, Billy's not in his right mind." He says, don't pay any attention to this. He says, "You've got to take care of him. You can't let him do this." And so by this time, George is already having pangs of guilt for firing Billy anyway. Yeah. And so they have this talk and this conference, and they decide that George says, "Well, you know, I really don't want Billy to leave anyway." And so, Doug says, "Well, Billy doesn't want to be anything but your manager." Well, meanwhile, Rosen has already hired Bob Lemon as his manager, his best friend. And so they come up with this idea. Doug says to George, he says, "Well, I got a great idea. Why don't you announce on Old Timers Day is 3 days from now. Why don't you announce on Old Timers Day that Billy's coming back as manager?" And so George says, "That's a great idea." There was only one problem. They had already committed to Lemon for 1979 as well. Yeah. So now they had to come up with a new idea where they're going to announce that Billy's coming back in 1980 as the manager. Meanwhile, there was only one problem with all of this. Yeah. Nobody ever told Al Rosen, and he's the president of the team. So now George has Rosen in his office the morning of Old Timers Day, and he says to him, "Al, I'd like you to go down on the field with all the old-timers today and put on your Cleveland Indians uniform and stand next to Lemon." And Rosen says, "Why would I want to do that?" And he says, "Well, I think Lemon would like to have some company down there, and, you know, it'll be good for the crowd and everything." So Rosen goes down there, and he's standing on the field. First of all, they start booing him because he's in a Cleveland uniform. Sure. And then he's listening to all these announcements, you know, one after another, the deities are being announced, and DiMaggio was always traditionally the last guy to be announced. And Rosen's saying to himself, "You know, I got to admit, this is a great team. You know, this is a great tradition here and everything." And then they come to DiMaggio, and then Bob Shepard, the PA announcer, says, "And we have one more announcement." And everybody's looking around. DiMaggio's looking around. And now all of a sudden there's this announcement, and coming back as manager in 1980 is Billy Martin, #1. And Billy comes charging out on the field. Rosen is aghast at this. Poor Bob Lemon is standing there. What is going on here? And so Rosen told me this story. I never knew this story, that Rosen was never told.
That's all Doug Newton's idea.
Right. It was all Doug's idea.
This business with Nixon, what did Steinbrenner do there?
Well, this was, he got caught up in the middle of Watergate, and essentially what he got caught up in doing was giving illegal campaign contributions to Nixon. And what really happened was George was, he had really built up American Ship, that this was his shipbuilding company, into a major entity, and with a lot of help from the Democrats in Congress. He got to know a lot of the powerful Tip O'Neill and Kennedy and all these guys, and he became a major fundraiser for the Democrats. In fact, they even wanted him to run, they wanted him to be the Democratic National Chairman, which he turned down. But now, this was in the late 60s, and his friends kept telling him, you know, if you want to keep getting these subsidies from Washington, you really need to pay attention to the fact that there's a Republican in the White House right now. And so he wanted to get in, ingratiate himself with Nixon, and that's what happened.
One time Trump told me, who, in spite of what people think of Trump, I think he's one of the smartest businessmen I've ever met, and one of the smartest people. But the paid sick stuff and all that is nonsense. But he said, if I'm going to buy a ship, I'm not going to buy it from George Steinbrenner. I'm going to buy it. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do. I'm going to buy what they really know how to build ships. So I don't really mean by that. But was Steinbrenner dishonest?
Well, as far as the Watergate thing is concerned, well,
if he's hosing Barbara Walters behind his wife's back, that's dishonest.
Well, we don't know for sure that he was doing that.
But we hope he was. Knowing?
Well, you're saying that, man, not me.
Well, I wish here's the thing. We could talk all day about this. So, but I get you get on with Francesca, and Francesca, I love to death, by the way. We'll spend an hour with you, and I wish we could. But I think this is going to be enough. You're going to have a huge bestseller.
Well, thank you. I hope so. Like I said before, it was this was 3 years that I worked on this book.
One of the most fascinating character studies of any figure in the history of certainly of sports and maybe just of anybody. I mean, it's like these fascinating biographies you read of historical figures, which is in fact what he is. So
yeah, well, he was. That was the hardest part, is really getting this thing into under 500 pages and organizing this thing.
Bill Madden and Steinbrenner, buy it this morning at BarnesandNoble.com or Amazon.com.